What's up, Coordination? On the pod today, we have Erik Voorhees, the one and only Erik Voorhees. OG in the crypto scene, has been building for over a decade in the crypto scene, originally in the Bitcoin space with Satoshi Dice and BitInstant, and most recently with Shapeshift the company, and then most recently Shapeshift the DAO. So Erik and I share the commonality of trying to turn a company into a DAO. Also, we are both Coloradians, but we're pretty far across the political spectrum from each other. I would code myself, well, I have many beliefs, but I have been coded as a lefty. Erik is a proud libertarian. And we talk in this episode about common ground, not just common ground between different political beliefs and how blockchains and Web3 enable new ways for libertarians to get what they want, but also lefties to get what they want, which is the funding of public goods and more pro-social types of causes, but also cooperation across social distance and common ground across crypto tribes. By virtue of Shapeshift being an exchange that helps people exchange one token for another, Erik has kind of been an elder statesman, or I guess whatever the crypto equivalent of an elder statesman is, since Erik is pretty anti-statist. But Erik has been sort of across different crypto tribes and is well respected by the Bitcoin community, the Ethereum community, and many other crypto communities as a leader and a pioneer in this space. And so I'm just really interested in pulling the thread of common ground and cooperation across social distance, not only from crypto tribes, but also from people who have different political philosophies, Erik being a libertarian and me being kind of like a green lefty kind of person. And so this episode is sort of exploring that design space of what's possible when we actually have conversations with each other. And I think that this is a key part of building a regenerative crypto economic movement. The broader tent that we can build around using Web3 to fund public goods, the better. And if we just keep on building messages that resonate with people who look like me, people from Boulder, Colorado, with like long hair and that are kind of like lefty, then we're missing an important constituency of people who care about libertarian type ideals. And this episode with Erik is kind of an olive branch to that community in order to figure out the common ground between those communities. And I think that we're not as stuck as the conversations, at least in the United States, our national media feels very stuck. Like there's gridlock in Washington between the left and the right. And I think in Web3, there's a lot of opportunity to close out the old divisions and to create new momentum towards pro-social and pro-public goods causes. And so we kind of traverse that terrain a little bit in this episode with Erik. It's a unique episode. It's not like one that I've done before. We're really getting into some interesting conversations here. So Erik is an idol, is a legend to me and to many in the crypto community. And I think this was a fun episode. So without further ado, I give you Erik Voorhees.
The GLOW dollar is a new stablecoin with a very special property. As the market cap of GLOW goes up, extreme poverty goes down. GLOW is a dollar-backed, non-profit stablecoin that creates basic income for people living in extreme poverty. GLOW is basically the same business model as USDC, with yield-generating treasuries on one side and a stablecoin on Ethereum on the other. But instead of being a for-profit company, GLOW is a non-profit that donates 100% of all yields from the GLOW Reserve to Give Directly's basic income program. Give Directly is a charity that gives people money, no strings attached, to people living in poverty, and is a charity that Vitalik has previously donated to and supported in the past. With GLOW, you can reduce poverty just by holding a stablecoin. GLOW is launching in early 2023, and you can join the waitlist at glowdollar.org/greenpill. That's glodollar.org/greenpill. Working in Web3 is awesome, but working outside of the typical W-2 employee structure is a deal breaker for so many. OPOLIS is helping the self-sovereign worker focus on what they do best: their work. Tax time is coming up. OPOLIS helps professionalize your business by helping you form an entity, generate proof of employment through pay stubs, and receive a W-2 at the end of the tax year. Are you self-employed and forced to spend money on expensive healthcare insurance with limited coverage? OPOLIS leverages group buying power through a community employment co-op, helping you save 20 to 50% on high-quality, affordable healthcare options through Cigna. And finally, OPOLIS's member owners share in OPOLIS's success and profits based on their work token holdings. You must be authorized to work work inside the United States and select Canadian provinces to receive OPOLIS's benefits. Book a 30-minute free consultation with OPOLIS's experts and join OPOLIS by March 31st, 2023 to get 1,000 work and 1,000 bank tokens. Go to connect.opolis.co/bankless to get started. And if you're going to EthDenver, make sure to stop by the OPOLIS booth or attend their Future of Work Summit hosted by OPOLIS.
Erik, what's up? How you doing?
Hey, Kevin. I'm good. How you doing?
Pretty good. Really excited to have this conversation with you about why you're in crypto and why I'm in crypto, and hopefully we can build some cooperation across that social distance. So, what got you into Bitcoin and why are you here? Why are you in crypto?
Yeah. So, I fell down the rabbit hole in May of 2011, and previously I'd been living in Dubai, kind of right after college. Moved there because there was no taxes at all, and that to me seemed like a beautiful sign of good civilization. So I moved over there, and it was during that time that the whole global financial crisis happened, like 2008-ish. And so I got really interested in monetary economics, how money works, how banks work, and came to the conclusion, or at least started thinking, that maybe the big issue was that money itself was being centrally planned by a monopoly, and that if a market was going to function well, probably money should be a market-based good instead of a coercion-based state good. And I just really didn't have like a lot of solutions for that. I just felt the dismay that all the world's monies were centrally planned by governments. I was a fan of gold, but realized that because it's physical, it has to be stored in large vaults that are secure, and so it can never really be like outside of the hands of the state. And then when I learned about Bitcoin, I realized that, wow, actually this is a possible alternative. This is like a market-based money that can't get turned off. You can send value to anyone anywhere instantly at nearly zero cost, and just fell in love with the whole thing. And so obviously it was a long shot that it would work out, but I was willing to bet on it and to commit all my years since then to it. So that's the genesis.
Yeah. So maybe we could spend a couple of minutes on the journey since then. I know that you've been involved in founding some pretty innovative products and companies in the crypto space. So if you could kind of speed run us through that, that'd be great.
Yeah. So back in 2012, I both joined BitInstant, which was, I think, the first like investor-backed company in Bitcoin. So Charlie Shrem started that in New York, and I moved from New Hampshire, where I was there as part of the Free State Project, down to New York to join Charlie to build BitInstant with him. And while I was at BitInstant, BitInstant, for those who don't know, was a way to move money very quickly to Mt. Gox, to move fiat money. So Mt. Gox back then was really the only Bitcoin exchange, and it was in Japan. And so if you wanted to get fiat there, it'd be like an international wire that would take a week or so. So we had a way of letting people deposit money at various locations in the US, and we would credit them like within a couple hours with our own money at Mt. Gox. It was quite cool. And it was around that time that I started Satoshi Dice, and that was the world's most popular Bitcoin gambling game. It was half of all the Bitcoin transactions from Genesis block up until sometime in 2013. So it was paying like half the mining fees of the whole network for the first 4 or 5 years of Bitcoin's existence. And it got a little out of control. And I ultimately decided to sell it because I was getting somewhat well known in Bitcoin by then. And what I care about most with Bitcoin is like the change for good that I see that it can bring the world. So I was a proponent and advocate of it. And I recognized that if I was going to do that well, I probably shouldn't also be running the world's biggest Bitcoin casino. Like I kind of need to pick a path just for optics reasons. So ended up selling Satoshi Dice back then. And after BitInstant and Satoshi Dice, I was in Panama for a year. And then after Mt. Gox collapsed, started Shapeshift. So that was back in 2014. Shapeshift started as an exchange for people to convert one digital asset like Bitcoin into another, like Litecoin. This was pre-Ethereum, and it did it without custody. So the Mt. Gox catastrophe weighed on me and almost destroyed the industry. And Shapeshift was an intent to build an exchange for digital assets that did not require custody.
Mm-hmm.
And that had its whole story over the last 8 or 9 years, and that's been my history with it.
Yeah. I just think that the idea of a non-custodial exchange is so groundbreaking, and it's maybe something we take for granted. I do a trade on Uniswap or on the new version of Shapeshift, and the assets leave my wallet, and there's some magic that happens, and then the new assets come into my wallet. But the state of the state at that time was not doing non-custodial transfers. And I think did y'all pioneer that?
Yeah, I think we were the first ones to do a non-custodial exchange. Obviously, it couldn't work with fiat, and so that was one of my decisions back then. It was like all the exchanges were fiat exchanges, fiat to Bitcoin, and Bitcoin was like 95 or 98% of the market cap of all digital assets. So people thought I was a little strange to do an exchange just for digital assets, like that was too niche. But I saw where the world was going. Obviously, there was going to be lots of digital assets, and so yeah, I think it was the first. It was obviously before smart contracts. So the
Yeah.
way it worked is that it operated much like a vending machine. So someone would send Bitcoin. The Bitcoin would go to our wallet. So we had a moment of custody, and then we would send the Litecoin out to the user moments later. So people had to trust us only for the moment of the trade instead of the entire period of where their funds were being held, which just reduced by 3 orders of magnitude the risk to the user.
You're right.
And we also, because we cared about protecting people, we also didn't take their personal information, so we had no KYC. And that became very controversial, but was something that was important to me because if someone's not even accused of a crime, I shouldn't have to take their personal information, period.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the things I think a thread for this episode for me is cooperation across social distance. And, one of the major arcs that I want to get into in this episode is like your sort of libertarian values and my more leftist values. But before we get into that, I just want to note the cooperation across social distance that happens with Shapeshift, because crypto is an inherently tribal industry. As anyone who spent any time on crypto Twitter knows, there is people from coin A that talk about how coin B is a shit coin and vice versa. And there's these narrative battles for the future of digital assets. And one of the things that has always attracted me to you as a thinker and a philosopher and executor in the space is that you're very pluralistic about assets. And I don't know which came first, sort of that philosophy or Shapeshift, a business that was built on that philosophy. But I've always just appreciated that you'll stand up to maximalists of all different crypto tribes. And you're kind of a nexus for cooperation across social distance in the crypto industry because you're above any specific asset. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, I mean, it comes from my interest in all of this, which was based on principle. Like, I am in this space because of principle, because of the principle of desiring an open financial system for the world.
Mm.
And whatever tools allow that to happen better, I am in favor of. So I fell in love with Bitcoin because it was the first plausible tool that actually enabled that. I've fallen in love with Ethereum because it can do things that Bitcoin can't do, and it works differently and in different beautiful ways. I love the privacy coins like Monero and Zcash because they actually let people be anonymous. And I love seeing just all the innovation that is happening because people are truly building like a decentralized financial system.
Mm.
And if you value decentralization, how can you not appreciate multiple blockchains being built in different ways by different teams with different assumptions, many of which will fail? Obviously, most tokens are totally stupid and most projects are going to fall apart. That's just part of how innovation works. That's not unique to crypto. But to be wedded to any specific asset instead of the principles, I think is really missing the point. And it's always bothered me to see these tribalists. They spend more time arguing between Bitcoin or Ethereum instead of realizing that like these two systems are complementary. Like they rise and they fall together. They are not eating each other's lunch. They help and enable each other. I love that Bitcoin has remained proof of work, and I love that Ethereum has moved to proof of stake. I think the diversity of those two consensus mechanisms is part of the strength of this ecosystem, because each has pros and cons. And I just see these as like, mutually beneficial things. And I wish people would stop fighting among themselves and realize that the actual enemy are the banks and the governments, the fiat financial system, not other open source developers.
I'd love to pull that thread. Just knowing what the arc of this episode is, I'm wondering if you can talk about why the banks and the government are the enemy. I wonder if you can talk about why coercion at the foundation of state power is a bad thing. Just sort of those principles that you've been adhering to since the start of getting into the crypto space. I'm wondering if we can dive into those for a few minutes.
Yeah. So yeah, fundamentally, everyone has to make some assumptions on how the world should work. And they have to make some moral and ethical assumptions and then build a worldview around it. And my assumption is simple, or my premises, which is just that it is better when humans are peaceful with each other. That we should respect each other as individuals. We should not cause each other harm. I shouldn't hurt you. You shouldn't hurt me. I shouldn't steal your stuff. And I shouldn't commit fraud against you. Like these kind of very basic things that 99.9% of people agree with. That's the fundamental essence of my whole philosophy. And everything else, all the other details, are just sort of a logical extension of that. Why am I anti-taxation? Because you're stealing from people. And we can discuss, why I define it in that way, but it comes from that principle of respecting your fellow man and not harming them. So yeah, that's why I think that a money system needs to maintain fidelity to that principle. If you have a fiat currency system where coercive laws from the government are not quite forcing people to use and hold, but certainly legally encouraging people to use a financial system that is debased, I find that to be highly unethical. I mean, essentially, the world is close to forced to being used fiat currency. And then certain people with certain privileges are able to print as much of that stuff as they want. They get the benefits before the price levels in the economy generally rise. And everyone that holds the asset and works for the asset, largely the poorest and least educated among the world, are the ones that suffer from that currency debasement. I think it's one of the worst scams, frauds, injustices of the world. And so when I see Bitcoin and I see a system that is open, immutable, and that everyone can access with the exact same rules in the same way, no one's forced to use it. It doesn't have any special legal privileges. It is purely a money of the market. To me, that is where the virtue of these things come from. And that's true whether we're talking about Bitcoin or Ethereum.
So one of the arguments that I heard in there was this argument against theft, and I think that there's sort of two examples of how fiat money enables theft. One is taxation is theft, because people didn't consent to being taxed, and then the second is debasement of the currency, which creates inflation of the currency, is theft. And those to me feel like arguments from first principles. I did not consent to my monetary system being debased or me being taxed, so therefore is theft. That feels like a first principles argument to me. But I also heard a causal argument in there that feels very pro-social to me. And as like kind of a lefty, I'm really interested in that as well, because you said that the people who are debasing the currency get the benefits of that new currency before the poor. And that feels like an economic justice, social justice, causal argument against those things, and so I just think it's kind of interesting to think that there's kind of like I don't see it often in the media, but there's kind of like a social justice argument against fiat currency in there, and I don't think that I've ever heard that from you or other libertarians before. Maybe I just wasn't listening for it.
Yeah, well, people on the left love to use this word access. Like people have people should have access to healthcare or access to birth control. Often access is used as a euphemism just to cover up the fact that it's an issue of poverty, that like everyone has access to healthcare. It's just a question of whether you can afford it. So but that word access is used, I think, because people like the idea that something is available sort of equally across all people. And it's interesting when those that are not part of the crypto world don't apply that to the money system itself, right? So if we're talking about the value of equal access to something, and we want to literally use the term access, none of us have equal access to the fiat financial system. If you're a bank with a banking license, you have privileges over that system to create money literally out of thin air. Like when a bank creates a loan for your mortgage, most people don't realize this, but they make the money at the bank when you get the loan. It's like just counterfeiting money, but because they have a special license from the state, they get to do that. If you did that, or if I did that, we'd go to jail. Similarly, the central bank obviously has even greater powers than that. Similarly, you and I can't like access the flows of money in the fiat financial system. We can't pull it up on an open blockchain and view all the money moving around the world, right? We don't have access to the information of the flows, whereas the banks do. So we can't create it. We can't access the information behind it. And this creates a huge disparity between people who otherwise should be treated equally. And what's so cool about crypto is that it didn't require anyone to like vote in the old system to approve it. It's just this alternative system that's sitting there, usable by anyone who opens their eyes to it, and everyone has equal access to it. And not just everyone in America, but like the entire world. Doesn't matter what color your skin is. It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter what country you're born into. It doesn't matter what religion you are or what sexual orientation you are. Like nothing matters other than you following the same objective rule set as everyone else. And to me, like that is true equality, and absolutely something that I think the libertarians and the leftists within the crypto community should align on.
I just want to kind of check on that framing a little bit, because I know that you and I did a panel at EthDenver last year, about 11 months ago, and David Hoffman was moderating it. And I think that he kind of presented me as the leftist at the table and you as the libertarian at the table. And that might be too reductionist, because I think that I have a superposition of beliefs across the political spectrum. I just happen to have long hair and talk about public goods a lot, so maybe people code me on the left. And I guess I'm asking, like, is coding you on the political spectrum as a libertarian too reductionist?
No, I'm absolutely a libertarian, and a very extreme one. So I happily embrace that label. I can define what it means. I think, interestingly, I think a lot of people on the left or the right, often, if you ask them like what it means to be on the left or the right, they don't quite have a consistent answer. And it's interesting to watch people on both sides of that spectrum take conflicting views that don't actually adhere to a single principle. My principle is, just as I mentioned before, that people should be peaceful with one another, and everything that I believe comes down to sort of trying to fit it to that.
I'm wondering if we can talk about, as far as I've read some libertarian philosophy, and it feels like this idea that taxation is theft is rooted on this idea that the government has a monopoly on violence. So basically, the implication of that is if you do not pay your taxes, then you'll be thrown in jail, and guns will be pointed at you. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the monopoly on violence, and is that at the root of the sort of libertarian problem with government? Is that basically the monopoly on violence is a violation of that principle that people should be peaceful with each other?
Yeah, and that, sort of all violence is a violation of that principle. Sometimes violence can be justified. So I'm not a pacifist in that regard, but the bar should be very high to justify violence. And I think one thing that might help people is society is very large and complex, and people kind of are born into it with all these understandings and memes and norms. And if you actually just reduce the space of consideration to a smaller set, you can see these principles very easily. So take, for example, like a society of, or like a, a desert island of 10 people, and they all find themselves there, no help is coming, and they're all just like trying to survive in the wilderness on the island. I think most people would agree that none of those people should like harm each other, right? Like that should be a good principle. And if if 6 of the people all raised their hands and voted for those 6 people to rule the 4, I think most people would have a problem with that. They'd be like, well, hold on a second. Why do the 6 of you get to rule the 4? But that's democracy. So I'm also not a fan of democracy as a principle. And I think when you take that set of 10 people on the island, most people are like, especially if you cast it like with men and women, then it becomes even more visceral. Let's say there's 4 women and 6 men. To what degree do those 6 men have the right to do whatever they want to the women just because they outnumber them? Right? I think they don't have any right to do anything to the women. The women are individuals, and it doesn't matter if it's 6 men or 100 men. Like the women should be respected as individual people. It doesn't matter if a vote is taken to violate them. And to me, that seems obvious on the example of the desert island, but somehow when you expand it from 10 people to 350 million, most throw that idea out the window and they think anything that is democratically voted is fine. And that's, I think, where a lot of the conflict comes from.
So what is the is there sort of like is this idea in neoliberal philosophy, or an argument that's put forth that's abbreviated as TINA? There is no alternative. And I guess that's my question for you: is there an agorist alternative to civilization at scale? Agorism being a social philosophy and creating a society in which all relations are voluntary exchanges without the state sort of forcing anyone to do anything. Like, is there a counterfactual version of the United States or the world or Colorado that is more agorist? That is there a social philosophy that has scale that looks more in that vein?
It's a good question, and I think before addressing that question, it's important to at least like agree on the moral principles before talking about the empirical results. Because I think it'd be reasonable for people to say, look, I agree that the 6 should not be able to vote on whatever they want and harm the 4. I agree that that's morally correct, but they must do it for X, Y, and Z practical reason or empirical reason or whatever. That's at least an intellectually honest way to proceed. So I think if you're looking at like what are the consequences and what are the alternatives, there's all sorts of counterfactuals, and there's also examples of like the efficacy of larger governments versus smaller governments. So you can see this all over the world. Like, to use the US for example, the US has a much larger government today than it used to. The entire industrial revolution of America and its period of fastest growth and greatest wealth creation happened in the 19th century, specifically in the latter part of the 19th century after slavery was abolished. And that happened without any income tax. That happened with a small national government. It happened with very little interference from government into the lives of ordinary individuals. And there's examples throughout the world, right? Like Hong Kong versus China, or South Korea versus North Korea, Switzerland versus other countries in Europe. Generally, when you have people permitted freedom, societies tend to thrive more than those societies which resort to central control and violence of things. There's obviously counterexamples that work against that, but as a general trend throughout history and across the world, I feel like that's fairly apparent. And so from my perspective, both the moral argument and the empirical argument toward respecting individuals as sacred, I think is a compelling one.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. The engineer in me wants to have like a little bit more of like case studies on both sides, and then we can maybe pull apart the different attributes of them and what caused those societies to grow. But what comes to mind for me is,
can we click on that for
Yeah.
a second? Because like if we go back to the island with the 10 people and the 4 women, yeah, I mean, imagine the engineer among them, right? A male, of course, who is saying, well, if the women do not comply, like we won't be able to have babies and the society will die out.
Mhm.
Thus, we have justification to rape the women, right? Like that's an engineer. That's from an engineering perspective. That's correct. And yet, good people should feel kind of disgusted by that. So
Yeah. Oh,
the problem with these societies is when people decide like I want to engineer how others live because I believe that there's X, Y, and Z benefit.
mhm.
You've violated the rights of that person as an individual, and that's a really slippery slope.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess like the engineer in me wanted to find like more examples of, does economic growth correlate with big government or small government? With respect to your
Yeah.
example on the island, I think that a pluralism of approaches to, like, in the United States, we don't just have rule by the majority; we also have the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so,
Supposed
to
to. Yeah.
reduce that down, well, yeah, to reduce that down to the island, I mean, a world in which the majority rules, but people have certain inalienable rights, limits what the majority can do
Yes.
to the minority, right?
Yeah, and that's a huge step forward. That's why like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were so important.
Mhm.
The problem is that they haven't been respected as much as they should, and arguably they don't protect as much as they should. But that
Mhm.
idea that there are things that the majority can never vote on because they're
Mhm.
inalienable to the individual, that's huge. And I obviously
Yeah.
think that the scope of things that should be inalienable to the individual is quite large.
Yeah, it kind of comes back to immutability when it comes to enforcement of the Bill of Rights. These
Yes.
are inalienable rights; they are immutable rights.
Yes, but unlike a blockchain, these are just words written by politicians, and they get degraded over
Yeah,
time as people both forget about why they were there, and also because they find, you
yeah.
know, um, reasons to degrade it.
So this comes back to an idea. Josh Stark, who's at the Ethereum Foundation, wrote this amazing post about where hardness comes from in the world. Hardness being basically a source of confidence that things will continue to be a certain way. And his point was that hardness comes from atoms and institutions and blockchains. So, like, the hardness of atoms means that there will only be so much gold on Earth. No one can make more gold without spending a lot of energy. Institutions, from the DMV to the United States government to the Constitution, are enforced socially, and then blockchains are enforced technologically, and then kind of like socially below that. So it kind of comes down to, where does the hardness or confidence that this will be enforced come from, I think, in both of these views.
Yeah, and there's a spectrum there. Certainly, like the physics of atoms is completely hard. Like it
Hmm.
follows rules that are not violated. Blockchains are quite close to that, like maybe all the way there. Like they operate on their code precisely as is written. And yes, their rules can change, but that the rules can change is one of the rules. So that's actually
Yeah.
not a violation, right? What you know about blockchains is that they will always operate according to the code. And this is a
Hmm.
very powerful feature that people really haven't appreciated yet in terms of like, if you care about law and order, blockchains are incredible because they execute
Yeah.
the rules objectively 100% all the time. Most people think of crypto as sort of an anarchic world, a wild west of these crazy libertarians that like just don't like rules, and that's so not true at all. The Bitcoin is a harder set of rules than anything that the United States government has ever created and will ever create.
Hmm.
So I think arguing it from a point of like we care about order and rule, and thus
Hmm.
we like blockchains. I think that's a compelling case.
Yeah. I want to introduce one more sort of a knowledge primitive to the conversation, and that's this post by Vitalik about legitimacy. Have you read this one?
No.
So basically, Vitalik sort of claims here that legitimacy is a pattern of higher order acceptance. An outcome in a social context is legitimate if the people in that social context play their role in enacting that outcome. So legitimacy, according to Vitalik in this post, can be achieved by brute force, which is, I think, what you would argue. Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe someone would argue that the government, the U.S. government does. We have a monopoly on force, and therefore we can enforce legitimacy. There can be legitimacy by continuity, legitimacy by fairness, legitimacy by process, by performance, and by participation. So, for me, a lot of this value space that you and I are talking about right here is kind of like different narrative frames on where legitimacy comes from and where it does not come from. And so I feel like this is an important knowledge Lego if we're going to build cooperation across social distance, because a lefty like me might say, oh, well, if we fund public goods with taxes, that's legitimacy by performance and maybe by process. And someone on the other side of the spectrum would say, no, like that's illegitimate because from first principles, taxation is theft. So, I mean, we'll get into the sort of disagreements between those things, but I just want to introduce the idea of legitimacy, higher order social acceptance as an important primitive in a lot of the examples that we're talking to. How does that resonate with you?
That's fair. I think legitimacy isn't a universal. So it's a very subjective judgment. So I might judge an outcome to be illegitimate or legitimate, and you might disagree, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Like I think it's hard to cast it as a universal that something is legitimate or not because of one reason across all people. I think it's an assessment that every individual has to make on a certain outcome, and they can use those factors, that Vitalik highlights in the judgment of whether they think it's legitimate or not.
Yeah. Well, we have 25 minutes left, and I really want to get to the meat of the discussion, which is the healthy tension between what I would see as, well, I think that you have good arguments from first principles that taxation is theft, and that people shouldn't be coerced into having their money taken from them. I think that people on the left who care about pro-social causes, who care about environmentalism, things that I would call public goods, have a good reason that we want to fund public goods. We're having this conversation, for example, over the internet, which was invented by ARPA, which was funded by a government grant. So, like for me, the argument that we want to fund public goods is like, hey, wouldn't you pay 20% of your salary to have a 1000% better world? Which, we'll get into debating those numbers, I'm sure. But the opportunity that I see, Eric, and the reason I wanted to do this podcast with you is that what if we could fund public goods without coercion from governments? Then we could unite the libertarians and the lefties like me around creating a world in which our commons are well funded, but we don't need to use coercion in order to do it. And maybe, there's a world in which when I fund the like, instead of just paying my taxes and it goes to whatever the bureaucrats want, I can like have a checkbox where I give to the collective and I say I want to fund the potholes in my community center, but not the war in the Middle East or something like that.
That'd be better.
And so, I'm trying to build this cooperation across social distance between the people who are in your camp and the people who are more in my camp. And I'm just wondering, how can we do that? Does crypto enable that? Is there a window of opportunity? Am I the only one who sees it? And yeah, I know that there's a lot there, but that's where I'd love to spend the next 25 minutes.
Well, yeah, I mean, just the recognition that it's a good thing to fund public goods without coercion is great. I mean, that's a virtuous statement that I would stand behind 100%. Yeah, let's find ways to fund the public goods without coercion. Like that's a libertarian perspective. Absolutely. Certainly libertarians aren't opposed to public goods. They're not opposed to the environment. They're not opposed to roads. They're not opposed to the internet. They are opposed to coercion. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a good way of starting that discussion for sure.
So I really want to pinch and zoom on that point. It makes me so excited for you to say that, Eric, because you sent this tweet in February of 2022 that said, like, I love public goods and obviously they're critical. To deny public goods is to deny the air that we breathe. And I think that, holy shit, that made me so excited that there's an opportunity here for like this podcast episode, but generally like cooperation across people who view legitimacy as derived from very different places. And it, I guess I just like want to ask the question, like, how can we build this world where we fund public goods in this way?
Well, I think it's important to point out maybe where we might differ on something here, which is that I would like a world where there's as few public goods as possible, and yet I acknowledge that some exist. Right, air being a great one, the environment generally being a good one. But I think humans work best when things are privatized, because it aligns the native self-interest that people have with the outcomes. So I want to reduce the scope in which something is considered a public good, but I know that scope can't be reduced to zero. And there's a lot of things that I'm curious if you call them public goods. So, like, for example, is the Ethereum blockchain a public good in your view?
You know what's fun is that since I founded Gitcoin, which is all about public goods, I started getting tagged in all these Twitter debates where it was like, "Hey, Kevin, this has a grant. Is it a public good?" And I was expected to like go on record about all these different things. And the fun part about Gitcoin being a DAO is I could be like, like go take a hike. The DAO could decide. But I can't dodge that here. I can't do that dodge here with you.
It will emerge from consensus. Yeah.
Yeah, and so to actually answer your question and not get into like some meta commentary about where legitimacy comes from, DAO processes or the founder's vision. I actually think that there's a lot of things that are on a spectrum of public-private goods. Ethereum is a double-sided marketplace between people who are writing to the blockchain and people who are reading to the blockchain. This is overly reductionist, but like anyone can read from the state of Ethereum and figure out what the global consensus is and do it for free. And that is a public good. But the ability to broadcast a transaction and write to the chain requires money, and it is excludable and rivalrous, and so it's not a public good. And so, you know, the hyper object of Ethereum is this double-sided or maybe triple-sided market, depending on how you count it. And one side is a public good, and another side is like this privatized market good.
Interesting. So, does a public good require as a prerequisite that it has free access?
So public goods, the economics definition is something that is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. So I am breathing air right now, and the fact that I am breathing air does not create a rivalrousness with you, Eric, that you can breathe air. And I cannot exclude you from breathing clean air. And that's what makes clean air a public good, is that it's non-rivalrous and non-excludable.
So roads and water are not public goods.
Yeah, so there's actually a 2x2 matrix. If you Google public goods and you click on images, you'll see a 2x2 matrix where there's excludable, non-excludable, and rivalrous, non-rivalrous. Roads are, I think, they're non-excludable because anyone can really drive onto them, but they're rivalrous in that they only have limited capacity. And the technical economics name for that is a common good. So something that's scarce, but like it's pretty hard to exclude.
Gotcha. Okay. Understood.
Yeah. So to me, I want to go back to what you said about the main point of difference, because if we're going to build this cooperation across social distance, we should spend time on where there's the most difference. You said that you wanted to minimize public goods and as many things should be privatized as possible. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Is that fair?
Yeah, like take healthcare, for example. I don't think people have a right to healthcare. The reason is because it has to be provided by someone. So to say you have a right to it is to say someone else has an obligation to provide it to you, which is slavery. And I don't believe in slavery because I believe people should be peaceful with each other. So that's an example of something that I would call like not a public good, should not be treated as a public good. I think there's a lot of things that those on the left would like to call public goods, and I'm not claiming that you're one of them, but they'll throw anything that people want, like kind of any base needs that people have, as public goods, because then once you do it, you justify all kind of coercion in granting those to people. So food, education, healthcare, roads, internet. I've heard people say cell phones are like a public good and people have a right to them. So that kind of goes off in some interesting directions. But yeah, I want to, because public goods are tricky, I want to limit the scope of them and then actually tackle the ones that are the most difficult. And certainly environmental pollution, I think, is the most important of those.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think just like recognizing that they're tricky and why they're tricky is maybe the highest leverage point for this conversation, because then that like everything else derives from that. So in my mind, public goods are tricky because they're non-excludable and non-rivalrous. That means that it's hard to build a business model for protecting them. And we know from Eleanor Ostrom's 8 principles of protecting the commons is that you need to be able to gate people's like access to them if you're going to maintain them over the long term. And so for me, the biggest problem with public goods is that there's no business model for maintaining them, which means that we all go get jobs at like JP Morgan or some like private company so that we can pay our mortgage, so that we can get food on the table, so that we can access education and healthcare, which means that there's not money or capital flowing back to the commons absent a coercive government forcing people to do it. But the flip side of that to me is that there's no feedback mechanisms about which public goods we actually care about because no one is paying for them. It's just left to some like central state planning bureaucrat to figure out which public goods tax dollars should go to. And the most beautiful thing for me about markets is that you get this collective intelligence mechanism of like, wow, people really love Shapeshift, and therefore Shapeshift has more capital to invest in making Shapeshift better. And it creates this virtuous cycle where like Shapeshift does even better. And so, what if there was a way to combine the collective intelligence of markets with the sort of like non-excludably non-rivalrousness of public goods? That feels like it would be the best of both worlds to me. But I don't know, you said public goods are tricky. That's what comes up for me when I think about public goods being tricky. I'm curious what comes up for you in terms of why public goods are so tricky.
Yeah, I think you defined that well. Like the issue is the tragedy of the commons generally,
Yeah.
right? Like who takes care of the thing when it's a public good. Um, and part of I think what helps in the discussion is to define specific public goods and talk about those,
Hmm.
right? Like, is there a universal way to solve the problems of public goods writ large? That sounds like a
Yeah.
tall order, but to take a specific one and to try to figure out solutions to solve that one in particular is
Hmm.
certainly a noble goal.
Yeah. Um, well, yeah, I mean, I think that like the vision that I see emerging out of the crypto ecosystem is a very holonic way of funding public goods. Holons are this idea that everything is both a part and a whole in itself. For example, like I'm Kevin, I'm an individual. You're Eric, you're an individual. Together and with other people in the crypto community, we make up the Colorado crypto community, and then we're part of this greater whole, which is the Colorado community. And so like holons are just basically drawing a circle around groups of other holons. And the holonica view of funding public goods is like to define a border around a community and to find a mechanism for distributing capital to public goods and a funding source for distributing capital to public goods. And like, the example of like we could just use the example of Ethereum. The public good of the consensus mechanism of the Ethereum network is determined by the consensus algorithm of proof of stake, and the funding mechanism is that people who are doing the writes to the network are taxed, are subsidizing the public good of the entire network, and that's like the whole on of the Ethereum network.
Yeah, I
And
wouldn't use the word taxed, but I won't be pedantic about it.
sure, yeah, I and then like there's other public goods in the Ethereum space, like who maintains Geth and Prism, and who funds the up and coming innovation in the ecosystem. That's kind of like what Gitcoin Grants is trying to be, along with Giveth and CLR Fund and others, is like create a mechanism and a funding source for the other public goods that aren't just like the transactional securement of the network. So I might be belaboring the point, but I think that the key point to like how we fund public goods in an agoric way is drawing a holon around what the public good is, and then finding a funding source and a mechanism for distributing those public goods. And so, using that frame, well, first off, I'm curious if you have any feedback on that. It might be overly complicated, but maybe we could actually object level talk about some public goods and how they could be funded in a non-coercive way using that view.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge untapped channel of using people's social desire for recognition and reputation
Mhm.
in funding philanthropic endeavors generally.
Yeah.
Like if you go out into the world and you see random strangers or you interact with people in your business or like on social media, there's no demonstration in any meaningful way of what those people are contributing to. And this is partly because it's just sort of like a social faux pas.
Mhm.
But wouldn't it be cool if like if you went to my Twitter profile and it showed like some badges of the things that I've contributed resources to, and
Mhm.
maybe including how much I've contributed?
Yeah.
And I would show those because I want to like say I care about these things, and look, I'm
Yeah.
putting my money where my mouth is. On blockchains, these things can be proven, and
Yeah.
there's none of that. Like there's no social custom of demonstrating that you care about these things. And I wish that was the case, you know. And I
Yeah.
certainly don't know how to change the way society works in that regard, but I wish it was more acceptable, and I wish people tried harder to demonstrate what they have put resources to.
Yeah.
And this is actually like a skin in the game question, right? Because you can go on Facebook and people will post all sorts of words about what they support, right? Because words are
Yeah.
cheap. You know, they'll
Yeah.
post the Ukraine flag on their profile, and suddenly they're like a war hero. And
Mhm.
there's just like there's no teeth to it. So I
Yeah.
wish we could get to a place where teeth were there and people would demonstrate things like financially and how effective it actually was.
Yeah. Well, this excites me because a tweet that I've sent in the past is like Web 2 is about virtue signaling, and Web 3 could be about proof of virtue. And
I like
it's the
that.
exact same view. Like you go to someone's Tinder profile and you see all the virtues that they actually have cryptographically proven. Twitter profile, whatever the social presence that you have, you can have instead of POAP's proof of participation, you can have proof of virtue, and I think that that could be a really um powerful thing to build. But I think that um the funding sources are only one half of the equation. You have to find ways to raise money for public goods, but then you have to route that money to the public goods that are actually legitimate. And so, I support Ukraine because I gave 1,000 DAI is like one thing, but like how did Ukraine, like how is that actually distributed? Did it go to Ukraine DAO, or did it go to some administrative charity that takes 89% off the top for administrative overhead? This is the other, by the way, big opportunity I see with crypto and funding networks is that you can run a network, a philanthropic network, using blockchain and use the properties of blockchains of transparency and immutability in order to create way more effective organizations, but less overhead organizations when it comes to actually distributing the capital. And to me, like
Absolutely.
removing intermediaries is where it's at. Like I fund a charity, I don't want it to go to the administrative overhead of that charity. I want it to go to creating object level impact. That's another opportunity for crypto I see.
Yeah, well, this is why DAOs can exist now, is because like the friction of moving money around and knowing where it is and accounting for it has gone down drastically. Like
Yeah.
DAOs can't work without blockchains. Um, they only exist because of what blockchains have done to the ease and the frictionlessness of funding, and so there's no reason that those benefits shouldn't accrue in other areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Eric, you've been really generous with your time. I think that we've only got 7 minutes left on our booked time. I can go a few minutes over, but I don't want to put you in that position. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to say, or anything that if you had an audience of 7,000 sort of like crypto lefties that you would want them to hear?
um, yeah, I think you're, Kevin, leading by example here in attempting to find common ground among people who care about similar projects, and I think that's a really important goal, right? So for the 7,000 lefties listening to this, um, try to figure out like what you really care about and find the people who can help with those ends, even if they don't agree with you. And I think this is an
Mm,
important lesson in crypto generally. The ends that we're all pursuing here is this like open decentralized financial system, and that is true of the most hardcore Bitcoin maxi or the like rainbow unicorn wearing ETH leftist,
mm,
and everyone else. Like focus on those principles and try to build common ground. I think that's like that's a key virtue of humans generally, is when they cooperate. And we have these amazing tools of blockchains that allow us to cooperate at scale with huge economic power. And if we let ideologies cause us to create tribal divisions that don't need to be there, I think that's a disservice to everything. So it's a long-winded way of just saying thank you, Kevin, for caring about like building bridges, and I hope other people are inspired to do the same.
Yeah. Well, same to you, Eric. I mean, obviously, you're an OG in the space, and you've pushed the envelope of innovation with Satoshi Dice and Shapeshift with non-custodial exchanges, but also Shapeshift becoming a DAO. I think you're pushing the envelope of, but and you're pushing the envelope of common ground and cooperation across social distance by being an anti-tribal, sane voice in the Bitcoin and Ethereum and other crypto communities. But I also just want to thank you for doing this podcast with me. I think that you reshuffle the dice 1,000 times, and people like me and people like you don't get to have time together in order to really resolve our our differences and to build that common ground. I think that 900 times out of 1,000, it's just like a Twitter flame war on social media. And if we can find a way to build that cooperation across social distance in the 21st century, that's one of the things that would make me so bullish for humanity. So again, you're leading by example, and thanks for joining me.
Yeah, no problem. Really appreciate that. And this is sort of why I hold this view of peace between individuals being so fundamental, is because I think you can cooperate and build common ground when two people start on the understanding that they won't harm each other. You know, and this is like a very primal precondition. But if two people are willing to say, like, I respect you, I'm not going to hurt you or steal from you, and if you give me the same respect, we can disagree about everything we want, but we know that we're safe with each other and we can find ways to build together. And I think that's really key. That's where cooperation comes from, and ultimately most of human progress.
It's a great place to end. Thanks again for joining me, Eric.
Thank you, Kevin. Cheers.